Hey everybody, Tim Ulbrich here, and thank you for listening to the YFP podcast, where each week we strive to inspire and encourage you on your path towards achieving financial freedom. This week, Tim Baker and I kick off a two-part episode on 10 common retirement risks to plan for. When planning for retirement, so much attention is given to the accumulation phase, but what doesn't get a lot of press is how to turn those assets into a retirement paycheck for an unknown period of time. When building a plan to deploy your assets during retirement, it's important to consider various risks to either mitigate or avoid altogether. And that's what we're discussing during this two-part series, where today we cover the first 5 common retirement risks, including longevity risk, inflation risk, excess withdrawal risk, unexpected healthcare risk, and long-term care risk. Now make sure to download our free guide that accompanies this series, that guide being the 10 common retirement risks to plan for. And you can get that at yourfinancialpharmacist.com/retirement risks. This guide covers the 10 common retirement risks you should consider and 20 plus solutions on how to mitigate these risks. Again, you can download that guide at yourfinancialpharmacist.com/retirement risks. All right, let's hear from today's sponsor, First Horizon, and then we'll jump into my conversation with YFP Co-Founder and Director of Financial Planning, Tim Baker. Does saving 20% for a down payment on a home feel like an uphill battle? It's no secret that pharmacists have a lot of competing financial priorities, including high student loan debt, meaning that saving 20% for a down payment on a home may take years. We've been on a hunt for a solution for pharmacists that are ready to purchase a home loan with a lower down payment and are happy to have found that option with First Horizon. First Horizon offers a professional home loan option, aka doctor or pharmacist home loan, that requires a 3% down payment for a single-family home or townhome for first-time home buyers, has no PMI, and offers a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage on home loans up to $726,200. The pharmacist home loan is available in all states except Alaska and Hawaii and can be used to purchase condos as well. However, rates may be higher and a condo review has to be completed. To check out the requirements for First Horizon's pharmacist home loan and to start the pre-approval process, visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/home-loan. Again, that's yourfinancialpharmacist.com/home-loan. Tim Baker, welcome back to the show.
Good to be back, Tim. How's it going?
It is going. We have an exciting two-part series planned for our listeners on 10 common retirement risks to avoid. And I think as we were planning for this session, just a lot of depth and great content that we want to make sure we do it justice. So we're going to take 5 of these common retirement risks here in this episode. We'll take the other 5 next week. And Tim, just for some quick background, one of the things we've talked about on the show before is so much attention is given when it comes to retirement is given to the accumulation phase as we're saving, especially for those that are maybe a little bit earlier in their career. It's save, save, save. But I even think for all pharmacists in general, that tends to be the focus. But we don't often think about, what does that withdrawal look like, both in the strategy, which we talked about on the show previously, but also in what could be some of the risks that we're trying to mitigate and avoid. So just give us some quick background on why this topic is so important as we get ready to jump into these 10 common mistakes.
Yeah, I think to your point, I think a lot of even the curriculum in, the CFP board, standards is very much focused on the accumulation phase of, wealth building. And I think there's a lot of challenges and a lot of risks that you have to, deal with, during that phase of life and during that phase of wealth building. But I think, what doesn't get a lot of the press is like, okay, you get to the end of the rainbow and you have hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars. And, the question is, how do you return these buckets of assets into a sustainable paycheck for an unknown period of time? And, while kind of navigating a lot of these risks, and, I don't know if it's, risk avoidance, Tim. I think it's just planning for the risk. We're talking about avoiding risks. Some of these you can't really avoid. You just have to plan for. And I think that, what we're finding is like, I think the whole general rule of like, oh, I'll get to the end and I'll, I have $1 million and I'll put, 4%, $40,000 a year for the rest of my life. There's a lot of pitfalls to that. And, I think that, hopefully this discussion shines a light on some of that. And, I think it is just important because we think that the hard part is, hey, I just kind of need to, put assets aside. But I think equally as hard is, okay, how do I actually deploy these assets for a wealthy life, for myself in retirement?
Yeah, good clarification, right? Some of these, as we talk through the 10, avoidance isn't necessarily possible. It's the planning for, it's the mitigation, right? Minimizing the impact, however we want to say it. And I think what you articulated is just spot on, right? I think when it comes to retirement planning, saving for the future, we tend to view that nest egg number, whatever that number is, right? 3, 4, $5 million, whatever, is the finish line. And so many other layers to consider there. Not only getting there, which again we've talked about on the show previously, and we'll link to some of those episodes in the show notes and the strategies to do so, but how do you maintain the integrity of that portfolio? How do you optimize the withdrawal of that portfolio? And if we're doing the hard work, right, throughout one's career to be saving along the way, we want to do everything we can to get as much juice out of that as possible. So that's the background as we get ready to talk through some of these 10 common retirement risks to plan for. And just a couple important disclaimers. We're not going to talk about every retirement risk that's out there, of course, Tim. So there's certainly more than 10. You'll notice some overlap as we go through these. So this is not meant to be an all-encompassing list. And of course, this is not advice, right? So we obviously advocate that our listeners, work with a planner no matter what stage of your career that you're in to be able to customize this part of the plan to your personal situation. So for folks that are interested in learning more about our one-on-one financial planning services, our team of certified financial planners and tax professionals, you can go to yfpplanning.com and book a free discovery call to learn more about that service. All right, Tim, let's jump off with number one, which is longevity risk. What is that risk? And then we'll go from there and talk about some potential solutions.
So longevity risk is the risk that, a retiree will live longer than what they expect to. And what this really requires is a larger stream of lifetime income. We'll talk about that in a second. The hard part about this whole calculation, Tim, is that there's lots of unknown variables. So unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess the way depending on how you're looking at it, I don't know when I'm going to pass away. So, Social Security obviously has kind of a good idea of what that is. And, when I was preparing for this episode, Tim, I went on to socialsecurity.gov and put in basically my gender and my birth date, and it comes back with a table, and it doesn't factor in things like health or lifestyle or family history, but it essentially says that for me at 40, it's tough to look at that, Tim, 40 years old in 10 months, that my estimated total years, I'm like halfway there.
I was going to say,
I'm gonna live 81.6. Now, once you get to age 62, then it starts to go out. At age 62, it says I'm going to live to 85. If I make it age 67, then it says, hey, I'm going to live to 86 and change. And then at age 70, which is when I think I'm going to retire, Tim, that's kind of like my plan at age 70, 87.1 years. But I think that for a lot of people, this is kind of an unknown. I kind of overlay okay, when did my grandparents pass away and things like that. Some general stats, 1 in 4 will live past age 90 and 1 in 10 will live past age 95. So, I think these stats are kind of, fly a bit in the face of, the Social Security, but maybe not. I think they factor some of this in. But, one of the big discussions that we have in our community is what should we plan to? What should we plan to? Should it be age 90? Should it be age 100? We kind of default to 95, which is kind of right in the middle. But for me, being in my 40s, it says 87.1 years old. So I think this unpredictable length of time really kind of puts a huge unknown out there in terms of okay, because there's a big difference between, I retire at age 70 and I pass away at 87. So that's 17 years of essentially senior unemployment retirement. Or if I live to 100, which is another 13 years, it's huge. And I saw a visual table recently, not to go on too much of a tangent, but it was your youth and then your college years was kind of so if you imagine a square was a shade on the square, and then, your career and then your retirement, and your career and retirement in this visual were pretty close.
Which we don't think about it like that, or I don't at least.
No, yeah. I don't either. But I saw that. I'm they're kind of I'm kind of eyeballing. I'm they're pretty close. So people think of rat race and things like that, but there's a whole nother race to run after, kind of your career. And I think we kind of overlook the time on that. So And I do think that people will, because especially with a lot of the economic things, people, maybe join the workforce later, starting families later, maybe starting to save later, we're living longer, that it could push everything to the right a little bit. And I think that could be one of the things that they do with Social Security is that, maybe we don't get our full retirement age at 67, then we get deferral credits at 70. Maybe they push those back a little bit. But it's still a long time, Tim, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, it really is. And as you're sharing, Tim, it reminded me of a great interview I had with a retired dean and faculty member, Dave Zagaric, on episode 291. And he talked about exactly what you're saying in terms of, that timeline perception. And he was really encouraging our listeners to reframe your retirement date as essentially like halftime, right? We've got some opportunities to reset, reframe, and figure out, but it's not the end of the game. There's a whole nother half that needs to be played. And obviously here we're talking about making sure that we're, financially prepared for it, but there's certainly much more to be considered than just the financial side of this as well. So, I think the piece here that really jumps out to me, Tim, when people think about longevity risk is there's really a lot of fear that I sense from individuals of, man, the last thing I want to do is run out of money. I don't want to be a burden, to my family members. I really want to make sure I plan for this. But the challenge I think here is there's a balance to be had, right? We also don't want to, get to the end of our life. And we've been sitting on this massive amount of money that, maybe it's been at the expense of living experiences along the way. And so I think this is just a really hard thing to plan for. And to your point, I think a general number is a good place to start. But, so much of this literature on longevity comes down to, family history, lifestyle, other things that's going to help inform this.
And I don't think that you can, oftentimes when we work with, particularly younger pharmacists, we'll get to a point, they're like, hey, I got it from here, like I'm good. And it's almost like they chunk like the next 5 or 10 years of their life as like autopilot. And I kind of always be like, if I look back at the last 5 or 10 years of my life, it's been anything but that. And what I would say to, even in retirement, you have to take it like year by year and you have to assess this year by year. I think, kind of hitting the easy button and saying, okay, for the next 5 or 10 years, it's going to be like this is not great for your plan, right? So, and I think that's probably, if we talk solutions, we're probably going to say this on repeat with a lot of these is like, you have to plan for this as best you can. So whether it's, setting a realistic expectation, like for me, I think it would be irresponsible for me to say like, okay, 87 years old, I'm going to, retire at 70, have set, and again, we'll talk about this too, is like, I might not retire at 70. I might have to retire a lot sooner than that. But if I say, hey, 70, and then I have to plan for 17 years, I think that would be really irresponsible. So I think setting realistic expectations in terms of like life expectancy, consider personal and family health history. I think you do pay a price, Tim, for a longer plan horizon, to your point, because you need more resources, which means that you have to save potentially more in your accumulation phase. And then when you're in retirement, you have to be more conservative with what you're withdrawing. And that could lead to like, again, you're kind of foregoing things today for, a longer future, I guess, or, being able to sustain. So, that's definitely one thing. It's just, how do you best, plan for longevity?
The other thing that's coming up for me, Tim, is just you're just sharing this solution around planning for longevity is if folks end up erring on the side of, your example, right? Social Security says one number, maybe you're planning 10 years further than that. Then there's an interesting, certainly you're mitigating one risk, but you're also presenting another risk, which is, potentially having excess cash at the end of life, which obviously there has to be planning done for that. What does that mean for the transfer of assets? Is there philanthropic giving that's happening? But then there's a whole tax layer to that as well, right? In terms of, how are the taxes treated on that if we're planning perhaps to not die with zero, but we may have, additional funds that are there at end of life. So just another great example, I think, of where the financial planning comes together with a tax plan, and obviously everyone's situation is going to be different.
Another solution that I would bring up for, this risk, Tim, would be lifetime income. And this is where, I think really a careful analysis of Social Security claiming strategies is needed. Because I think a lot of people, they're like, okay, I'm 62, I'm eligible for my Social Security. I think my parents died at, 80, probably going to die right. Like, so there's a lot of things that I think, we just kind of blow through. One of the biggest retirement decisions is just going to be like this decision on how and when you're going to claim. Social Security is lifetime income. So if you start claiming at 62, you'll get that until you pass away. If you start claiming at 70, you'll get a much greater, benefit until you pass away. So there's not very many sources of income like that. Pensions might be another thing, but that would be one of the things that we would want to make sure that, if we need X per month or per year, a good percentage that is lifetime income, meaning not necessarily out of your portfolio like a 401k. Another way to do this is to transfer the risk of longevity to an insurance company by, purchasing something like an annuity. So you can provide protection from the risk of dying young by purchasing a term certain. So you could say, hey, I want this annuity to pay me for a lifetime and I'll get a lesser amount, or for the next 10 years and I might get a higher amount. But a lot of people are really, not crazy about that because they could, give an insurance company, $100,000 and then get one or two payments and die the next month or whatever. But there are refund riders and things like that. So I think looking at that is something that definitely in the lifetime income. I think one of the things that people don't know of is, if you have a 401k, a lot of people, they'll take a lump sum and they might put it into an IRA. And one of the things that you could do is take annuity payments for life out of that plan. What they essentially do is go out, most of the time they go out and buy an annuity for you. But that's another way to do it. Instead of taking a lump sum, you can buy, basically annuity payments from, a 401k, that type of 403b. You can get, lifetime income from insurance contracts. So, cash value life insurance, death benefit, there's an annuity option. If I have this can even be true for like a term policy. If I pass away and Shay most times will elect a lump sum, but you could say, hey, I want this payment for life or for X amount of years. So Social Security is probably going to be the biggest one, but then, kind of an annuity or something like that would probably be a close second to provide lifetime income for you to negate some of the longevity risk that's there in retirement.
Yeah, a couple of resources I want to point our listeners to. Episode 294, 295, you and I covered 10 common Social Security mistakes to avoid, along with a primer we did back on episode 242 of Social Security 101. So really reinforces what Tim's talking about right here. And then we covered annuities on episode 305, which was our Understanding Annuities, a primer for pharmacists. So certainly go back and check out those resources in more detail. Probably lots of avenues to consider, but any other big potential solutions as people are trying to mitigate this longevity risk?
I think probably the last one, then, there are others, but probably the last big one I would bring up is probably like, what is your withdrawal strategy? So, we've mentioned kind of the rule of thumb of like 4%, but I think that's limited in a lot of ways. One is, a lot of those studies are based on a finite number of years, i.e. 30 years from age 65 to 95. And we know that people are, living beyond that 30 years that, that's been planned. That's one thing. So, for longer periods, the sustainable withdrawal rate should be reduced, but typically only slightly. What's left out of that, the 4% study, is flexibility. So the more flexible you can be with your withdrawal rate, the greater the portfolio sustainability will be. So when the portfolio is down and you can withdraw less, that allows you to, sustain the portfolio, a lot longer. And then I think the other thing that's often overlooked with this is that, typically, and we'll talk about sequence risk, but typically, like once you get through that eye of the storm, retirement risk zone, you want to start putting more equities back into your portfolio. So I think just the proper allocation strategy, which, where you're considering portfolio returns, inflation, what your need is, what your flexibility is. And again, I think that becomes a lot easier or palatable if you have, say, like an income floor, or if you have a higher percentage of your paycheck coming from Social Security. So all of these things are kind of, just like systems of the body are intertwined, but just your withdrawal strategy and allowing for that to sustain you for lifetime is going to be very, very important, along with, some of the other things that we mentioned.
Yeah, Tim, I think there's a couple things there that are really important, to emphasize that I think we tend to overlook when it comes to, the withdrawal strategy. One of which you mentioned was that flexibility, or the option to be flexible on what you need. When we show some of these examples, we just assume, hey, somebody's going to take a 3% or 4%, withdrawal every year. But depending on other sources of income, you've mentioned several opportunities here, depending on other buckets that they have saved, right? That flexibility may or may not be there, which ultimately is going to allow for us to be able to maximize and optimize that even further. All right, so that's number one, longevity risk. Number two is inflation risk. Tim, I think this is probably something that, maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago, people were asking, hey, what inflation? Obviously, we're living this every day right now. So we've seen some extremes, although our parents would say we ain't seen nothing yet from what they saw growing up. What is the risk here as it relates to inflation?
We're going to talk about inflation a few times, in this series, but what we're talking about with regard to this risk is this is really the risk that prices of goods and services increase over time, right? So the analogy or the story I always give when I kind of talk about investments is, that $4 latte, that you might get from Starbucks in 2020, 30 years might be $10, $11, $12. And, if you look back at I would encourage, a lot of people that, hey, I had a conversation with this with my parents, like, what did you buy our house back in New Jersey? And I think they said it was like $41,000, and now like when they, because we were talking about like what we bought our house at and like the interest rates are like, it's unbelievable. Like they don't understand. So I think this is a huge thing, especially like with retirees, you're kind of thinking or you're dealing with, like a fixed income, more or less, So the larger percentage of your income that's protected against inflation, which Social Security is, which is another reason that it's also very valuable, is because it's lifetime, but then basically it gets adjusted by, the CPI. So when you work, Tim, inflation is often offset by increases in salary, right? So like the employer kind of has to keep pace as best they can,
Hopefully,
or they'll lose talent. In retirement, inflation reduces your purchasing power, so you don't have an employer to kind of raise, you. Now, like I said, you can kind of think of Social Security like that because they're gonna, do that adjustment every year. But essentially, in retirement, inflation could essentially erode your standard of living. So again, the first solution here is, plan for this. I would throw taxes in here, but even inflation is often like overlooked in terms of like, how do we project these numbers out? So what is a realistic estimate of inflation over the long term? And I would encourage you, again, I'm a financial planner, so I'm biased, but I think using software and, accounting for inflation, but almost by, category of expense. So we know that things like medical expenses, the inflation for medical expenses is going to outpace a lot of other things, whether it's, fuel or utilities or food, that type of thing. So that would be the big thing, is like, I think overlaying some type of inflation assumption into your projections and seeing, how that affects your portfolio, your paycheck is going to be super important. Another solution to this, Tim, would be kind of going back to the longevity, but so we talked about like lifetime income. I'm going to say not necessarily lifetime income, but inflation adjusted income. So Social Security, again, is the best of this. So we saw, last year, I think it was, someone might have to correct me, it was like 9% year over year. So that's pretty good. Like if you were to buy an annuity, a lot of insurance company won't offer like a CPI rider. So they might say, hey, your payment in your annuity, you can buy a rider, which is going to cost a lot of money. That it says it'll go up a flat 2 or 3%, but the insurance companies are not going to risk saying, okay, it's with whatever the CPI is, because they're not going to be able to price that accordingly. So inflation adjusted income, some employer sponsored plans like a pension could offer some type of COLA increase. This is more typical in government pensions, government plans, than it is with private plans. Like I said, you can purchase a life annuity with a cost of living rider, but it's typically very limited and very, very expensive. You might get, for kicks, Tim, and these are just round numbers, you might say, hey, give me, straight up $1,000, that's my benefit. But if I add like a COLA rider or something like that, it could cut it down to like $800. And again, that's not real numbers. That could be the cost there. And then the last thing for this is kind of build a bond ladder using tips. So a bond ladder is essentially, and we could probably do a whole episode on this, Tim, but a bond ladder would be, hey, basically I want to build 10 years of income, say. So let's say I'm retiring in 2024, then or let's say 2025. So my first bond ladder might come due at the end of 2024. And then that's going to give me $30 or $40,000. At the end of 2025, going into 2026, the second rung of my bond ladder is going to pay me, and basically do that for the next 10 years. And then essentially what you do is you try to extend that ladder out. So you might go to year 11, might go to year 12 as you're spending that down. So a good way to do that is with TIPS, which is an inflation protected security. That's one way to kind of inoculate yourself from the inflation risk.
I looked up the Social Security while you were talking there. You were spot on. 8.7% in 2023. So yeah, that's significant, right? I think especially for many folks, and hopefully as our listeners are planning, that won't be as big of a percentage of the bucket for retirement. But for, the data shows that across the country, it really is,
Yeah. And I think, again, I think when we've gone back to my own, it was something like if I claimed at 62, I have to remember the numbers. If I claimed at 62, my benefit would be 2,500. If I claim at 70, I think it's over like 4,000. So, but then if you then tack on the inflation on that, it's just huge. So again, I think that is going to be one of the most important things that you evaluate in retirement, is the Social Security stuff.
One of the other thoughts that's coming to mind, Tim, as you were talking with inflation is, just like rates of return, we tend to, at least on a simple high level, right? We think of rates of return and a very consistent, 7% per year. We know the markets don't obviously act like that. We have huge ups, huge downs. We're seeing that with inflation as well, right? We tend to project, 2.5%, 3%, but we lived at a period where inflation was really low. And obviously we're now seeing that bump up. And so my question for you is, as you beat this up with the planning team, has this period of high inflation, at least high of what we've seen in our lifetime, has that changed at all some of the modeling or scenarios that you guys are doing long-term?
I think we've ticked it up a bit. I definitely think it's probably too soon to say hey, for the next, 30 years, we got to go from, 3%, which has typically been the rule of thumb, to 5%. I think as we get a little bit further from, quantitative easing and, putting a lot more money in circulation, and we're seeing kind of the results of that I do see some modification of models, and that's going to be needed. So, one of the things that the government and the Fed try to do is keep inflation at that 3%. I just don't know if they're going to be able to, the new norm might be keep it as close to 4 or 5%, right? So I would say for me, and again, I try to keep on this as best I can, but I think for me, I think it's a little too soon to tell. To your point, the reality is that I would say less so for inflation, because I think, there is a little bit of, the thumbs on the scale with the government and the Fed, but we do see fluctuations in market returns. We're seeing now more fluctuation in, inflation. And I think, a lot of what I'm reading is that we're probably at pretty much the end of, rates going up, but I'm interested to see is okay, when they start to, potentially reverse or normalize, what is the new normal? I think if you put as much money into circulation as we have, I think this is one of the side effects, and, we're kind of paying for that now.
The other thing that's coming to mind here as you're talking about inflation risk and even tied to longevity risk is we often assume retirement is a clean break, right? You are working full time, you're no longer working full time. And for many folks, either based on interest or passion or financial reasons, there could very well be some type of part-time work, right? Whether that's, consulting, whether that's, part-time PRN work or whatever. That, to me, that's another tool you have in your tool belt when you talk about, inflationary periods or what's happening in the market and whether or not we need to draw from those funds. Having some additional income, if you're able and interested, could be an important piece of this puzzle.
We often think of it like a glide path in retirement. So meaning that, the closer we get to retirement, the less stocks we have, the more bonds we have, safety, that type of thing. I think we have to start talking more about a glide path, like a work perspective, where you go from 1 to 0.8 to 0.6 to, 0.2 or whatever. And then maybe it's just, 1099, PRN or something like that. So, and this is for a variety of reasons. It's for the reasons that you mentioned: market forces, inflationary forces. I think even more so for mental health.
Mental health, yeah.
IR, like we talk about, our identity and role and things like that, and kind of a soft landing. I think abrupt retirement sounds sweet, But I think in reality, I think it's really hard for, if you've been in the workforce for 30 years, and there might be people that are like, nope, like you're crazy, Tim. But I kind of talked about this, and, some retirees will probably like roll their eyes. But, when I took my sabbatical, like it was just a month, right? So it wasn't like a ton of time, but I literally was like, all right, I'm not going to touch work. And I'm like, what am I doing? Like, I guess my thought process was I could see how it could be where you're directionless, right? And I spent a lot of time planning for just that month, and I'm like, it was an interesting, kind of test case for me to be like, all right, like I just need to make sure that when I'm positioning myself, like I still have availability for meaningful work and other interests and things like that. So yeah, I mean, like everything that you read is that the best thing to kind of combat a lot of these risks is actually not to retire. It's to kind of work or work at a reduced, like if you're working and you're not drawing on your portfolio, then, problem solved. But obviously we know that's not necessarily like the best solution. But I think having the ability to do that, there's a, from a mental health perspective and a lot of these other reasons. And I think pharmacists in particular are positioned with their, clinical knowledge and things to do things with their PharmD that provides value, in retirement, and that is not necessarily stressful or strenuous, so.
Yeah, I think that feeling of contribution is so important. I was just listening to a podcast this week with Dr. Peter T on one of my favorite podcasts, the Human Lab podcast, and he was talking exactly about longevity and some of the risks, to longevity. And in that context of mental health, he was talking about, the value of contribution, the value of, work. And I think for all of us, it's natural in those moments and seasons of stress, that feeling of contribution can get overlooked, right? I mean, I think it's a natural thing to feel. So really, really good discussion. I think it highlights well, we're obviously talking about X's and O's in terms of dollars, but when it comes to retirement planning, so much more than that. Number 3, Tim, we talked briefly about, but we can put a bow on this one, would be excess withdrawal risk. Tell us more here.
Yeah, this is really just that you're withdrawing at a rate from the portfolio that will deplete the portfolio before you die, which is one of the biggest fears and one of the biggest risks is like, hey, I just want to make sure that I have enough money to last me throughout retirement. So, I think the biggest thing again for this is to, have a plan, have a strategy, and be flexible with that plan. There are ways that you can build your retirement paycheck, and we've talked about this before, where it's coming from a variety of sources. But at the end of the day, there is still going to be a portion of your paycheck. The retiree, you are pulling the string. You're saying, okay, I'm going to get X amount from Social Security, potentially X amount from maybe a floor like an annuity, but then the 60% or whatever it is has to come from these buckets that I filled in the accumulation phase. So like I said, the default that a lot of people use is, hey, it's the 4% rule. There's other strategies like Guyton Klinger, guardrails that are more look at market forces, look at inflation, and then basically adjust your portion of your paycheck accordingly. And if you do that consistently and you kind of stick to that plan, you'll basically see, the portfolio sustain for, 30 plus years. But I think that's probably the big thing that, in all the research says is that if you can adapt your spending, which is hard, right? It's hard for us to do that in the accumulation. It's often hard for us to do that in retirement. But if you can adapt your spending to kind of ride the roller coaster of market volatility, inflation, it lengthens sustainability. So we've also talked in the past about like, the bucketing strategy. So you make sure that you have the next 5 years basically in very, CDs, money markets, very safe investments. And then that allows you to kind of inoculate, at least for the next 5 years, to do more mid-risk, type of investments. And then, for that 15 plus years, more risky investments with regard to the portfolio. So the bucketing strategy is just kind of a take on the systemic withdrawal strategy, but allows the retiree to kind of understand more and kind of compartmentalize to say, okay, if I have the next 5 years planned out, if I need, 40,000 times 5 years, I have that in that bucket. So I don't really care what the market does. If the market goes down today, I know that in most cases it's going to recover in the next 3.5, 4 years, and we're good to go. But again, a lot of people, I think, will say, all right, well, this year, regardless of what's going on in the world, I need this. And then the next year, and then they wake up and they're like, man, I had $1 million, 7 years in retirement. I have 200,000 left. Like, this is no bueno.
Yeah, and another important point you're bringing up here, and you mentioned earlier in the show, I think we tend to oversimplify, especially when we're thinking accumulation of, hey, I'm going to save $2, $3, $4 million, and maybe I'm going to be moderately aggressive or aggressive, and then I retire, and we don't think about what is the aggressive to moderate to non-aggressive strategies of investing in retirement, right? But we're not taking a portfolio of $2, $3, $4 million and all of a sudden just moving it into something that's liquid. We still have to take some calculated risk, to your point earlier, that we've got potentially a long horizon in front of us. And, Tim, what I think about is the double whammy of potentially when you retire, which, depending on where the markets are, you may or may not have control of that. I think about people that may have retired pre-pandemic, not knowing what was coming, and then the markets did their thing. And the double whammy I'm referring to is if you retire and start withdrawing at a period where the market's down significantly and you're dependent on that draw, right? We've got a double effect of what we're getting hit there.
Yeah. And we'll get into more of that in the sequence risk, in terms of like, it's less about the actual return and more about the sequence of when that return comes that can affect, basically the sustainability of that portfolio.
And since you mentioned the buckets and building retirement paycheck, as you called out, we did cover that previously, episode 275. We'll link to that in the show notes. And that was one of 4 episodes that we did, 272 through 275, on retirement planning. All right, so that is number 3, excess withdrawal risk. Tim, number 4 on our list is unexpected healthcare risk. Tell us more here.
Yeah, this is one we haven't really covered much, and we probably should give it a little TLC maybe in future episodes. But, I think that, Medicare and the decisions around Medicare is also another huge decision to make in retirement. So this is the risk of facing increase in unexpected medical expenses in retirement. So one of the things that people often get wrong is that it's like, okay, I qualify for Medicare at 65, I'm good. All my medical costs will be taken care of. And it's like, that's not true. So the decision of when to enroll and whether to choose, original Medicare or Medicare Advantage plan, choosing the right, Part D plan for drug prescription is really going to be important, and the figures, they're not overly impressive, Tim. So in 2019, they said, average male at age 65 is going to spend about $79,000 to cover medical or healthcare costs in retirement.
That's lower than I would have thought, to be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I think it goes out. I mean, again, you can kind of see, if you look at the tables, what did it say for me? At 65, I was going to live to, it doesn't have it, 62 to 67. But let's say it's, another 20 years. Yeah, it seems low to me. I mean, females age 65, it's a lot more, 114,000 to cover healthcare expenses in retirement. It doesn't seem like a lot in terms of like it is outside of housing. It's going to be one of the bigger things, especially when you're in the phase of like, older retirement. I think probably the default thing here is it goes back to like planning and understanding, what's available to you. So I think choosing the appropriate insurance is going to be important. And one of the things, and we'll talk about this in the next risk, but a lot of people think that like long-term care is covered by Medicare. It is not. And another thing that a lot of people don't know is that Medicare doesn't have a cap on out-of-pocket expenses. So, if you have large amounts of medical expenses, like you could be paying, in perpetuity. So that's where a supplemental plan or a Medigap plan will be important. So Part A, to kind of break these down, kind of cover a lot of hospital visits and inpatient stuff. Part B is more, I think outpatient, like covers medical necessary services like doctors, service and tests, outpatient care, home health services, durable medical equipment, and that type of thing. And then Part C is going to be the drug. And then there's going to be lots of variations of, Part D. And then what people then assess, Tim, is should I get a supplemental plan or a Medicare Advantage, which is not necessarily under traditional Medicare, but it's more of a reimbursement through a private medical or private insurance company. So this is one that I think that is often overlooked. And it's hard because every state and area of the country is going to be different. So, what you can get if you're a resident of Florida is going to be different if you're a resident of New Jersey or Ohio. So I think going through this and probably like on an annual to reassess is going to be an important part of making sure that you're mitigating as much as you can the risks of those increased or unexpected medical expenses while retired.
A couple of things are coming up for me, Tim, here. Obviously, one would be if we're factoring this into the overall portfolio nest egg, certainly that's one strategy. The other thing I'm thinking about, if folks have access to an HSA and are able to save in that long term without needing those for expenses today, and obviously if you need them, you use them, that's what it's there for. But if not, the opportunity is for these to grow and to invest in a tax-free manner such that it could be used for six-figure expenses, right, in retirement. And we've got an exciting, October is all going to be about healthcare insurance costs. We're going to have several episodes all throughout the month, one of which is going to be focused on Medicare. We're also going to be talking about healthcare insurance for those that are self-employed. And then we'll be talking about open enrollment, other topics as well. So looking forward to that series that we're going to do in October. Tim, number 5 on our list, which will wrap up our part 1 of this 2-part series, is long-term care risk. Now, we did talk about long-term care insurance previously on the show. That was episode 296, 5 key decisions for long-term care insurance. You just mentioned not something that Medicare is going to cover. So tell us about this risk and potential solutions.
Yeah, so this is the risk of essentially not being able to care for oneself. It basically leaves you, kind of dependent on others to perform or help you perform the activities of daily living. These ADLs are called activities of daily living are bathing, showering, getting dressed, being able to kind of get in and out of bed, or in and out of a chair, walking, using the bathroom, and eating. So typically if you need help with 2 or more of these things, this is typically where like a long-term care insurance policy will actually trigger. And these can be caused for a variety of, it could be chronic diseases, orthopedic problems. Alzheimer's is probably the biggest one that is the biggest threat for this particular risk. So planning for this is huge. And it's funny, Tim, because not funny, but it's interesting is that this is one of the risks where it's like, it's not me, right? It's someone else. So most people see this as an important thing to plan for, but not necessarily for themselves. And the reality of the situation is that in most cases, family members will provide the care, which is about 80% of the time in the home, which is unpaid care, averaging about 20 hours per week. So if you imagine that, Tim, if that were kind of laid at your feet, how that could affect your health, your finances, just kind of your career. And that's kind of the effect that it has on the family. So like I said, most people think that Medicare covers long-term care costs. It doesn't. Many people think that this is a risk or a concern in retirement, but not necessarily for them. It's for somebody else. And, I think one of the misconceptions is like, if you look at things like insurance, a lot of people think, hey, it's too expensive. And that, I think, that reputation is probably earned because I think when they first priced these policies, when they first came out, there were a lot of policies that were not priced expensive or the right way. So they got more expensive, year over year. There was a study that said that less than 10% of people that were age 65 and older had long-term care. Really, the need is not as long as you think. The average time that a male needs, long-term care is about a little bit more than 2 years, and for females, a little bit less than 4 years. So solutions for this is, kind of plan for this, understand, what are the risks and costs associated with it. Again, like every state is going to be different in terms of what this costs and, what is the cost for something like anything from being able to like age in place and have care given in your home to like a nursing home. So understand like what is that in your area? How do you want to pay for long-term care? And how do you want that care delivered? And a big part of this is just getting organized with, okay, like if this were to happen, where can we get this money from? Is it an insurance policy that we purchase? Is it family members? Is it something like a reverse mortgage? Are there government programs? Like if you're a veteran, there's some programs for that. Could be Medicaid. So that is a program that's probably the largest funding source of long-term care, but you have to be impoverished to do so. And a lot of people will purposely spend down their estate to become impoverished to get care, which there's a lot of like hoops and things that you have to be careful of. But insurance is probably, I know we did an episode on this, is like, that's another one to really look at, is when to purchase. A lot of people, we should really start talking about this in late 40s and purchase in your 50s. I think 55 is the average, if I'm not mistaken. If you wait longer than that, Tim, that's when you have increased instances of the coverage being denied and it gets really expensive. So you kind of have to thread that needle a bit. What is the amount needed? So I think at a minimum, we should be pricing. We say, okay, for us to be able to age in place, so have someone come in 20 hours a week, 5 days a week or whatever that looks like. Is that $3,000? Is that $6,000? And find that number and be able to, a lot of the study says the longer that you can stay in your home and not in a facility, the better. What's the amount? Is that inflation protected? What's the elimination period? Is it a straight up long-term care insurance plan, or is it linked to like an annuity purchase or a life insurance purchase? Or if you go through all that, you're like, you know what, I got this, and we self-fund, which is probably the most popular, self-fund with kind of the family as kind of ad hoc caregivers. Unfortunately, I think that's really more of a lack of planning than anything. But that is a solution as well to say, okay, if that's the case, again, looking at funding sources and things like that. This is another thing that I think is often overlooked because I think some of the misconceptions about long-term care. But if you can get a policy that pays you $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a month for care to be able to kind of stay in the home, I think for a variety of reasons, that's worth looking into.
Yeah, Tim, I agree. I think that this is often overlooked perhaps from a misunderstanding or, evaluating the risk. The other thing that comes up for me often here is just the difficult conversations that need to be had to really navigate this. We just a few episodes had back on the show Cameron Huddleston, who is just fantastic. And she wrote, Mom and Dad, we need to talk. How do you navigate difficult financial conversations with parents? And like some listening to this are thinking about it for themselves, certainly. Others may be working with aging parents, right? And trying to navigate these conversations. And who wants to initiate a conversation of, hey, mom and dad, like, what are you doing for long-term care insurance? Or, maybe that age window has passed where a policy makes sense. And now we're back to, okay, what's the game plan? And what does this look like financially? What does this look like in terms of, ability of our time to be able to care and care well? I think there's just a lot to navigate here that is not just financial, but that is emotional as well. And she does a great job in that book and the episode we just recorded as well of how do you initiate these conversations in a loving and respectful way, but more than anything to get out in front of the planning. So again, whether you're planning for yourself, whether you're planning for aging parents, so important to be thinking about this.
And this is a little teaser into, kind of our next few risks that we'll cover in the next episode in terms of just tough conversations that need to be had so we can kind of prevent things happening in the future. It's just kind of a byproduct of old age and, being able to care for oneself. And that can be hard to, broach those subjects with your children, even adult children. And, there's some vulnerability. And I think, just the way you approach that, and obviously people have different, relationships with parents, and some people are really close. Some people, brought up in a house where you don't talk about money, you don't talk about some of these things. And that can be really hard. And, I think, one of the things that really, stuck with me with, Cameron's work and her writings is like, you don't want to get to a point where you're having to like go through the courts to get the care that your loved ones need. And if you can avoid that at all costs, even if it means having an uncomfortable conversation, or, maybe it's not a conversation, maybe it's a letter to break the ice, and you go from there. I think it's needed.
Yeah. And, whether it's the courts or in her instance, and we're going through this right now with my grandmother as well, but in Cameron's instance, she had a mom who was struggling with memory loss and Alzheimer's that, her message, one of her main messages, hey, you want these conversations and planning that be happening before, right, those instances are in question where you're now dealing with, more challenges of is someone in the right state of mind to be able to make those decisions, and what are the legal implications of that. So great stuff, Tim. So that is 5 of the 10 common retirement risks to plan for. We're going to be bringing the rest of this list back on the next episode. So make sure to join us here next week. And of course, for folks that are listening to this and thinking, hey, it'd be really helpful to have someone in my corner that really can help me plan for retirement as well as other parts of the financial plan, we'd love to have a conversation with you to have you learn more about our one-on-one fee-only financial planning services, as well as to learn more about your individual plan and the goals that you have. You can book a free discovery call by going to yfpplanning.com. Again, that's yfpplanning.com. All right, we'll see you next week. Before we wrap up today's show, I want to again thank this week's sponsor of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast, First Horizon. We're glad to have found a solution for pharmacists that are unable to save 20% for a down payment on a home. A lot of pharmacists and the YFP community have taken advantage of First Horizon's Pharmacist Home Loan, which requires a 3% down payment for a single-family home or townhome for first-time home buyers and has no PMI on a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. To learn more about the requirements for First Horizon's Pharmacist Home Loan and to get started with the pre-approval process, you can visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/home-loan. Again, that's yourfinancialpharmacist.com/home-loan. As we conclude this week's podcast, an important reminder that the content on this show is provided to you for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding materials should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on the podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of Your Financial Pharmacist unless otherwise noted and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you again for your support of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. Have a great rest of your week.